I'm Sean Collins of the Collins Law Firm. I want to talk about how the landfill that you might live near can contaminate the groundwater, which is an especially important issue if your family's water coming out of your kitchen tap, coming out of your shower head in your bathroom, comes from the ground via a private well. This is something you especially want to pay close attention to. What we want to focus on is landfills that were built before 1980, that first started accepting waste before 1980. Is your landfill one of those? If it is, then this is what you need to be concerned about. In my experience, landfills built before 1980 didn't have a liner. Landfills today do. Landfills back then didn't. Now, what's a liner? Well, start out this way. Think of a landfill when it first starts accepting garbage. When the garbage first is dumped in there, landfill is a big hole in the ground. Today, landfills have a very thick liner at the very bottom that protects the groundwater at the very bottom of the landfill against whatever garbage, waste, etc. is being dumped in there. Before 1980, landfills were supposed to have liners, but again, in my experience, very frequently did not. Another thing that happened very often before 1980 is there were no standards about what was allowed to be dumped into the landfill. Now, very frequently, the written permit for the landfill said, for example, no industrial wastes are to be dumped in this landfill. But was that rule followed? Typically, no, because it was very profitable for landfill operators to accept all kinds of horrible, hazardous industrial waste, and that's what wound up in these landfills. So once again, landfill's a big hole in the ground, carved so deep, it's often carved right into the groundwater. And when you say no liner, in other words, no protection for the groundwater, and all kinds of terrible hazardous waste being dumped right into the groundwater, then what landfills built before 1980 were really very rapid ways of polluting the groundwater. And that becomes a problem if your family depends upon the groundwater. Now, I dealt with a case a couple of years ago where a family that lived more than a mile away from a landfill had its water supply contaminated by that landfill. You might ask, how can the contamination get that far in the groundwater? Well, it can. In fact, it can go well beyond that. And sometimes it takes years. Sometimes chemicals dumped, let's say in 1975 in a landfill, horrible hazardous waste, might take 20 or 30 years to get to that family's water supply. But then it does and can cause terrible problems. So what do you do about that? Well, number one, check when was the landfill that you live near constructed? If before 1980, be careful and think about these other things. Two, are you on a private well? I mean, you would probably know that anyway. If you are on a private well, then you want to think about number three, which is what direction does that groundwater flow? In other words, very specifically, does it flow directly from the landfill toward me, toward my home, toward my neighborhood? Because if it does, and what you're going to want to do is appreciate that your groundwater, your water supply is at risk from the early days operation of that landfill. And what's your best measure? What's your best protection? Test. Once or twice a year, test the groundwater that's coming into your home. Now, can it be very expensive? Sure it can. And so one of the best ways you can protect yourself against that kind of expense is to go in with your neighbors. Recruit your neighbors because they have the same concerns that you do. They don't want their water to be contaminated either coming into their home. So join with them, hire a company that can test all of the wells in your neighborhood. It can be done very inexpensively on a per home basis, and you learn very valuable information that you really need to know if your water is coming from the ground that flows directly from a landfill constructed before 1980 into your neighborhood.